Knight and Changeling, Chapter 15. Gifts and Betrayal. Jen sat at the table in the empty lot of Mr. Smoothie's. She wasn't sulking. She was planning and wondering. How had a group of humans come to worship the Dagon, a literal, destructive demon? But then again, she'd been asking herself for a while now how a group of knights who'd started defending the world could turn into one of the most xenophobic groups she knew. Time seemed to be the answer to both of those questions. She flicked through George's journal. Well, the translation Kai and Gregory had done. She'd given him back the original. He went into some detail about the varied forms of the Dagon here during their search for the creature. Apparently, she had only seen one of its forms. It could take on the form of a squid thing, carved into the stone door of the headquarters of the Flamekeeper's Circle. A light flashed on the table, and Jen leapt backward, hand going to the ultimatrix. No need for that, Jennifer. She sighed as azimuth formed on the table. Sitting back down, she took a long draw on her smoothie. She raised an eyebrow at him. I am here because a great threat bears down on your world. Jen nodded. Yeah, the Dagon. Azimuth froze. How did you know that? That was well before your time. Jen rolled her eyes, looking up as though asking some great being for patience. Got tossed back to medieval England and helped George beat it. He's out looking for the sword now. Why are you here? Vague warnings? 'Cause honestly, I could do with less of those. Azimuth blinked. I suppose so. Does anyone else know? Jen shook her head. No, I don't know who I can trust right now. One of the Lacubra escaped the seal already. It got into Gwen's head, which is why I ended up tossed through time. I beat it without... I don't know how much of it might still be there, or how to beat it without killing the Dagon again. And now there's a group of humans who claim it's the Knowledge Bringer. Jen rested her head in her hands, and Azimuth tapped the ultimatrix which word to life. Access Master Control, Code 10, Command Override Primus. Jen felt the rush of power through her veins like she'd only felt once before. The first time she'd ever set foot on Primus, the world that held all the DNA information for the Omnitrix. She was shaking when she again became aware of her surroundings. She was still sitting on the bench at Mr. Smoothie's. Azimuth standing on the table in front of her. A soft green glow surrounded her, and Azimuth was tapping at the lines of code on her skin. She blinked and breathed out. The code lines flickered and vanished. Azimuth nodded. Make a flame in your hand, he ordered. Jen blinked at him. He raised an eyebrow. She lifted her hand and focused on how it felt when Heat Blast made a flame. Her hand lit up like a torch, and she laughed, putting it out just as quickly. She frowned at him. Can I still transform? He nodded. You can use the Ultimatrix to do it or not, but yes, your ability to transform won't be affected. The only visible side effect is your pupil. Nothing I can do about that, but I believe you said you didn't want to walk around looking like a cyberpunk makeup nightmare? Jen laughed and then sobered. Why? You never trusted me enough to give me master control without serious threats happening before. Azimuth shook his head. I trusted you. I still do. I did not believe you were ready. But if you're going to face the Dagon again, I want you prepared this time. She nodded and stood, a plan forming in her mind. Thank you, Azimuth. He nodded. Use it wisely. He vanished as she threw out her empty smoothie cup and raced to her bike. Getting into the Flamekeeper Circle headquarters was far too easy. She slipped in, invisible as chameleon, a new transformation she'd acquired during the debacle at Area 51 with the illegal alien prison Colonel Rosum had been hiding. The transformation was a large bipedal purple chameleon-like alien with multiple green eyes that could manipulate the light spectrum around itself and appear invisible. She could also climb walls with ease, something she took full advantage of as she slipped into the stairwell and made her way to the floor Conduit Edwards had met them on. It was empty. She climbed up the wall and shifted to upgrades, sinking into the security system and easily looping the video feed to the whole floor. She slipped out of the camera and transformed back into herself. Confident that she was no longer observed, she slipped into the large stone room where the carved door was hidden behind a curtain. She yanked it aside and stepped up to the door. It took a moment to find the switch that opened it, but she pressed it, and it opened. Slipping inside, she blinked as her eyes adjusted to the dark. She frowned slightly, and, using Wildmutt's senses, made her way to the light switch. She turned to the center of the room as a low, familiar laugh echoed around her.
Jen Tennyson, I was wondering how long it would take you to find me.
Jen blinked at the sight in front of her. There was a large tank nearly from floor to ceiling, and inside the tank was a very familiar figure. A near 10-foot-tall, squid-like thing with familiar, shining red eyes. Jen stared for a minute. Vilgax? She asked. She hadn't fought him long like this, and she'd been close to death at the time, so she needed the confirmation. The tentacles flexed as the creature laughed.
Of course. Did you believe I died in that explosion?
Jen stayed silent, her hand curling into her torso. Vilgax couldn't see the comm unit she was activating under her shirt.
You came close to finishing me off with that crash, as I know was your intent. I was weakened, unable to return to my normal form, swept out to sea. Eventually, I washed up on shore. I was too weak to stop myself from being sold to a traveling carnival, but it gave me food and shelter to regain my strength. I was liberated by these interesting humans, the Esoterica, not too long ago. Quite loyal. They've even acquired a Class 7 starship for me.
Jen nodded slightly, stepping a bit closer to the tank. And when they deliver you your starship, Vilgax? She asked coolly, knowing that someone on the other end was listening. Hopefully there would be a team on the way. The giant squid writhed in the tank, nearly rising to the surface of the water.
I will find that traitorous siphon and drag him back to my empire in chains. I will rule my worlds once again.
Jen shook her head. Hate to break it to you, but Siphon is in the null void, and your empire collapsed when everyone heard you were dead. With no tyrant in charge, the worlds you subjugated freed themselves. You have no empire. He hissed angrily.
You lie!
I really don't, though. That tends to happen when a despotic leader disappears. The beings under their control take back power. Vilgax roared in anger.
Guards!
He shouted, and Jen darted to the door, slamming it shut and wrenching the lock into place. Vilgax laughed.
You cannot stop the Esoterica with doors.
Jen heard footsteps behind her and dropped, avoiding the fist that swung where her head had been. They were difficult to fight. It seemed they had the ability to not simply appear and disappear, but somehow step between dimensions and appear somewhere else, run on air, and they packed a punch. Jen used the Ultimatrix to transform into Big Chill, freezing them in their tracks. It helped, but they were too quick for a regular Necrophrygian, so she went Ultimate Big Chill and froze the Esoterica where they stood. A voice called from the now opened door. Stop this at once! Jen whirled on the door and found Conduit Edwards standing there in robes unlike his fully covered soldiers. His hand was wrapped around Julie's upper arm. Stop now or I will lose Julie between worlds. Edwards threatened as the arms of one of his Esoterica sprouted from thin air and grabbed Julie's hands and made to tug her into the void. No! Jen transformed back to herself, dropping out of the air and landing in a crouch. Her hand came up to her calf, and Julie thought she spotted a flash of silver. As Jen straightened, but there was nothing in her hand. You win. Let her go. Her voice was steely as Conduit Edwards released Julie. It's okay, Jen. He wasn't going to hurt me. We just needed you to listen. Jen's eyes narrowed dangerously. What? Her voice was low and icy. It was the only way I could get Big to chill out. They were right, Jen. The Dagon is back, and he's going to help humanity. He's going to take his ship and bring back new technology to make Earth a better place. Jen was shaking with rage. That's not the Dagon, it's Vilgax. Julie froze as she reached out to comfort her friend. What? Julie's voice shook, cracking with realization that maybe she'd been wrong this whole time. He's been lying to all of you. He gets on that ship, he'll fly off and start an interstellar civil war. Conduit snarled, "Liar!"
No, she's right. Except about the flying off part.
Jen let out a slight breath as Kevin and Gwen came into the room. Julie looked confused. Gwen was kind enough to explain.
They stole a plumber ship. We took it back.
Kevin held up a yellowish-green crystal.
And it's not going anywhere without the pulse core.
He was already covered in metal and smashed his fist into the crystal, which shattered into dust. Vilgax roared,
"Kill them!"
Chapter 16. Crossed. Jen moved first, a knife appearing in her hand as if by magic, and she threw it hard into the glass of the tank. It shattered into pieces, and Jen grabbed Julie as a wave of water came crashing into them. Only Vilgax saw her hand whip out of the water that cascaded across the room. The dagger she'd thrown flew into her hand as if summoned, as she transformed into Jet Ray, seizing Julie by the shoulders and flying out of the room as Gwen and Kevin raced out. Conduit Edwards screamed. As the water rushed out of what was left of the tank, Vilgax gasped as the Esoterica rushed to help him. He thought as they worked to rebuild his tank. She had not touched the Ultimatrix to transform. That was not a power she'd had before. And how had she managed to summon the knife to her like that? He was intent on finding out. "We are the Flamekeeper's circle, we do not doubt. The Dagon will transform this world," Vilgax smiled lightly.
"Indeed. When I'm done with this world, you will not recognize it."
The four of them raced outside the building and paused for breath. They weren't being followed. Julie reached out to Jen, but she shook her off. "Don't. Just don't." Julie shrank slightly as Gwen and Kevin raised eyebrows. Jen was still shaking with rage as she pulled up her pant leg and sheathed her dagger, yanking the hem of her jeans back into place with a bit more violence than was strictly necessary. "Jen, I didn't mean to..." Jen cut her off. "Didn't mean to what, Julie? Didn't mean to fake a hostage situation? Didn't mean to use our friendship against me? Which was it?" Julie was silent. "I didn't know." Jen turned to her, eyes cold. "I tried to warn you. I told you to stop going. I told you that maybe I know something you didn't. But you didn't listen." Jen shook her head and walked away. Before any of them could stop her, she transformed into Jet Ray and vanished quickly into the night sky. Gwen shook her head at Julie.
"I'd leave her alone for a while."
Kevin nodded.
"She might forgive you. She's forgiven me for worse. But, yeah, let her breathe for a while."
Julie burst into tears. Gwen hugged her, patting her on the back. Kevin was less ready to forgive. After all, he'd been there. He'd warned Julie about it, too. Jen knew something they didn't. He frowned as he got in his car. Something had just occurred to him. Jen hadn't touched the Ultimatrix to turn into Jet Ray either time tonight. How had she gotten master control back? He didn't get an answer to his question, not for the next few days. Discovering that Albeda had escaped the explosion of Vilgax's ship too was a bit of a surprise. Her making some cash by creating a stage production based around Jen and several of her aliens was somewhat hilarious. The Vaxasaurian girl who played Humungosaur had warned them that Albeda was planning something beyond the show, which the ex-Galvin claimed was over anyway. She'd led them to a warehouse where Albeda had indeed built a device. The fight between the two on top of the machine was quick, Albeda tossing Jen off the structure, but the damage was done. Though Albeda could now shift without any assistance, though her time in those aliens seemed to be limited, she was stuck, going back to the negative form of Jen she'd been trapped in before. She was still quite angry about that as she escaped, vowing vengeance. Jen sighed and turned back to normal. Kevin was closest to her and frowned. Her eye was different, just like it had been last time Azimuth had given her master control. Her pupil had split, forming the Omnitrix symbol inside her eye. He frowned, but didn't bring it up as they headed back to Mr. Smoothie's. When Gwen ducked out to use the restroom, though, he raised an eyebrow at Jen.
"When did you get master control back?"
He asked, and she blinked at him, her hand lifting to cover the affected eye. "Azimuth seemed to think I'm ready. He popped by a few days ago, fixed it for me. No idea why. He tends to do what he wants. I didn't want to make a big deal about it. Kevin nodded slightly, and they slipped back into silence. But Kevin wasn't convinced that that was everything. He'd figure out what was wrong. Gwen was still having nightmares. The shadow that had been haunting her dreams after she'd thrown Jen into the past was growing closer. She had no idea what it was, but it grated on her every nerve. She sighed as she buried her head in her hands. There was a tap on her door. She shook her head slightly. "Come in," she called, and the door opened. She smiled. "Grandpa Max!"
Hey, Pumpkin.
He opened his arms, and she rushed from her desk chair to hug him. He smiled.
I haven't seen you for a while. Thought I'd check up on you.
Gwen smiled.
"It's been a stressful few weeks,"
she said, sitting on her bed. Max sat down next to her.
Do you want to talk about it?
Gwen shrugged.
"I feel like Jen's pulling away. She normally tells me everything, but..."
She paused.
"Did she tell you what happened when we ran up against the Lacubra?"
Max nodded. It had been an odd moment when Jen had shown up at the base and sought him out, practically leaping into his arms. She had explained some of what had happened, but not everything. He could always tell when she was holding back. He had so far let her keep it to herself, but if this kept up, he might just have to sit her down and figure out how to get her to tell him everything. Gwen nodded and continued.
"It feels like she doesn't trust me anymore. I mean, I guess I understand her having issues trusting me after what I did, but..."
Max pulled Gwen into another hug.
You didn't do that, Gwen. We all know that.
Gwen sniffled slightly but nodded.
"Still, I don't think she trusts me anymore, and I don't know how to fix it."
Max rubbed calming circles on Gwen's back.
Be there for her as much as you can. That's all you can do right now.
Gwen nodded, holding on to her grandfather as she sniffled.